You're listening to the free ad-sponsored re-release of American Election's Wicked Game, a weekly march through every presidential election from 1789 to 2024. To listen to all episodes right now, ad-free, go to intohistory.com. Subscribers there enjoy ad-free listening, early access, bonus content, and more from a growing collection of great history podcasts. Start your free trial today at intohistory.com. A listener note. This episode quotes historical records containing racially offensive language. It's January 1986 in London. A group of men sit in a hotel room talking business. These men are from 3 different countries: Israel, America, and Iran. Leading the meeting is a member of President Reagan's National Security Council, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. Ollie, as he's known, is here today to discuss an upcoming shipment of tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided missiles, or TOW missiles, to Iran. During a break in the discussion, one of the Iranian businessmen suddenly stands. "Excuse me, gentlemen?" Ollie perks up at this. It's not like Maneker Ghorbanifar to step away in the middle of an important discussion. "Everything all right, Mr. Ghorbanifar?" "Yes, I just need the men's room." As Ghorbanifar walks away, he glances back and gives an almost imperceptible cue for Ollie to follow. Ollie then quickly excuses himself and follows Ghorbanifar into the restroom. "What couldn't you say out there, Gorba?" Ghorbanifar, or Gorba for short, turns on the bathroom sink. As a former member of the Iranian secret police, he leaves nothing to chance. He believes the hotel room might be bugged. He's right. Gorba leans in and speaks almost in a whisper. "Ollie, if we can make this deal work and get these missiles to Iran, there's something in it for you." And what would that be, Gorba? $1 million? Ollie didn't come to the hotel expecting a bribe, but he's not the least bit surprised. He knows Gorba does business in a world where bribes and backroom deals are commonplace. Still, Ollie didn't take this meeting for personal gain. Terrorists loyal to the anti-American Iranian leader, the Ayatollah Khamenei, have taken Americans hostage and are being held in Beirut. Getting those American hostages back is the Reagan administration's top priority, and that's the only reason Ollie is here. "Gorba, that's out of the question. Don't bring it up again, or this whole thing is over." Seeing the displeasure on Ollie's face, Gorba nods knowingly. He won't push the subject. Never mind. I understand." Gorba doesn't want to scare Ollie off, but he knows the American wants this deal to happen just as much as he does. In return for receiving the shipment of TOW missiles, Iran will release the American hostages. This arms for hostages deal, however, is illegal. The United States Congress put an arms embargo on Iran, meaning the Reagan administration cannot sell them weapons. To circumvent the law, the administration has resorted to this clandestine meeting in a London hotel with representatives from Iran and Israel. Gorba smiles at Ollie North. He's about to make his final sales pitch. "Well, there's another way. I know what you've been doing in your spare time. Make this deal work, and maybe instead of lining your pockets, we can make some money available for your friends in Nicaragua." Well, now that's interesting. The meeting in January of 1986 between Ollie North and Maneker Ghorbanifar was perhaps the beginning of what would come to be called the diversion, wherein money from the Iran arms for hostages deal was funneled to another of President Reagan's top priorities, fighting communism in Central America. As part of Reagan's effort to defeat communism, his administration supported a counter-revolutionary force known as the Contras. They had been fighting against the Sandinista National Liberation Front, or the Sandinistas, a socialist party in Nicaragua. Reagan once compared the Contras to the Sons of Liberty. He saw them as patriots who were making a stand against the communist Sandinistas. But many Democrats did not share Reagan's zeal for the Contras or their sometimes violent methods. Starting in 1982, after the Democrats took control of the House of Representatives, Congress passed the first of several Boland amendments, eventually making it illegal for the U.S. to use taxpayer funds to try to overthrow the Nicaraguan government. Ollie North maintains that the diversion was not illegal. But Congress disagreed, and after the depth of the Iran-Contra affair became public, Congress began multiple investigations. Under pressure, Reagan appointed a special prosecutor, Lawrence Walsh. Walsh, a lifelong Republican, would investigate Iran-Contra for 7 years. He would interview thousands of witnesses and pore over hundreds of thousands of documents. His investigation reached into the National Security Council, the Departments of Defense, Justice, State, Transportation, and Treasury, the CIA, the Office of the Vice Presidency, and ultimately, the Oval Office. From Airship, I'm Lindsey Graham, and this is American Elections' Wicked Game. In the summer of 1987, the United States Congress and much of the American public heard Oliver North's testimony about his involvement with the Iran-Contra affair in a series of televised congressional hearings. Americans sat glued to their TVs day after day to get a behind-the-scenes look at what some called the biggest political scandal since Watergate. The Iran-Contra scandal involved two complex covert operations in two different countries, one in the Middle Eastern country of Iran and one in the Central American nation of Nicaragua. The scandal revealed that the Reagan administration was ignoring Congress and U.S. law, selling arms to a country they were prohibited to sell arms to, and using that money to support a group of rebels they were prohibited from supporting. After his lengthy investigation, Republican Special Prosecutor Lawrence Walsh would write that while he could not prove President Reagan personally broke the law, he believed that Reagan knowingly participated or at least acquiesced in covering up the truth about Iran-Contra. Many Republicans disagreed with the special prosecutor's assessment of Reagan's involvement. Republican Senator Bob Dole called it a big witch hunt, and the Teflon president not only survived the Iran-Contra scandal, he left office with the highest approval rating of any president to serve 2 terms. Still, many in Reagan's orbit did not escape Iran-Contra unscathed. In the end, 14 administration officials were indicted, including Reagan's Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger. 11 were convicted. But even before the public hearings began, Iran-Contra cast a shadow over the GOP and the party's likely frontrunner for the 1988 contest, Reagan's Vice President George H.W. Bush. Many wanted to know, what did Bush know, and when did he know it? With Reagan on his way out and a scandal brewing, many Democrats saw 1988 as their chance to take back the White House. It was a crowded field. Civil rights activist Jesse Jackson, Delaware Senator Joe Biden, Tennessee Senator Al Gore, and a little-known Massachusetts governor named Michael Dukakis. But the frontrunner was perhaps a liberal senator from Colorado named Gary Hart. Not long after announcing his candidacy in April of 1987, though, Hart would find himself wrapped up in a scandal of his own. The 1988 presidential election, like the Iran-Contra affair, would be marked by a series of secret meetings and vicious attacks, and both parties would have to fight their way through a maelstrom of scandal. This is episode 51, 1988, Bush versus Dukakis, Character Assassinations. It's Monday, April 27th, 1987. It's 8 at night, and Miami Herald political editor Tom Fiedler is still working. Normally, he'd have already gone home, but he recently traveled to several different cities gathering political news. He wants to arrange his notes before he calls it a night. Just as he's about to finally wrap things up and head home, his phone rings. "Yeah, this is Tom Fiedler." Fiedler hears a woman nervously laughing on the other end of the call. He's ready to just hang up, but then the laughing suddenly stops. Without introducing herself, the caller starts talking. You said in the paper that there are rumors that Gary Hart is a womanizer. Yeah, those aren't rumors. How much do you guys pay for pictures?" I read the article in Newsweek and the one we put out. No, it's nothing but rumor mongering." The woman laughs again, but Fiedler means business. A Newsweek profile on Gary Hart included an unsupported claim that the Colorado senator had cheated on his wife. The Newsweek article spawned several other stories in newspapers across the country, including the Miami Herald. But Fiedler is a serious journalist. He doesn't deal in rumors. "Ma'am, I don't have time for crank calls." "I have proof. My friend and I met him at a party. It was mainly models, actors, entertainers, not a place you'd expect to find a presidential candidate. But Gary Hart was there, and I have a picture of him with my friend." Politicians have their picture taken with people all the time. It proves nothing. The caller takes a breath. The nervous laughter disappears. Her tone turns deadly serious. "I'm a liberal Democrat. but I can't stand for people to say one thing publicly and act differently in private. The country just had that with Reagan and the Iranian arms deal. Fiedler leans in. Look, it would take more than just a picture to prove anything. If I give you information, could I stay anonymous? I see no reason to use your name if you give me information I can independently confirm is true. All right. Senator Hart calls my friend from the campaign trail all the time. They've been on a cruise together, and now he's asked her to spend this weekend with him in Washington, D.C. Miss, you should pause and think about the gravity of what you're saying. Why don't you sleep on it and call me back if you still want to proceed? The woman did sleep on it, and she made her decision. The next morning, she called Fiedler back and laid out the dates and times her friend had supposedly talked to Gary Hart and where the senator had called her from. As Fiedler dug into the details, he found the story more and more credible. Still, the woman had said Gary Hart would be staying with her friend in Washington, D.C. over the upcoming weekend, and that didn't check out. Fiedler knew Hart was scheduled to speak in Iowa and then travel to a Kentucky Derby event. For the avoidance of doubt, Fiedler called the Hart campaign and asked for the senator's schedule, suggesting he may want to cover the Derby festivities. A campaign staffer told Fiedler the Kentucky trip had been canceled so Senator Hart could take some time off in Washington, D.C. After confirming the D.C. trip, Fiedler acted quickly. By the weekend, Miami Herald reporters were staking out Gary Hart's D.C. townhouse. After hours of surveillance, they spotted the senator and a blonde woman who wasn't his wife emerge together. They watched as Hart walked the woman to a car and then turned to go back inside. Herald reporter Jim McGee confronted Hart outside of his home. Hart angrily denied anything illicit and got into a heated exchange with McGee, but it was too late. On May 3, 1987, the Miami Herald ran a story stating that the allegations of Hart's infidelities were more than just rumors. Hart and his people continued to deny the allegations publicly, but the potential scandal quickly overwhelmed the campaign. On May 8, 1987, less than a month after announcing his candidacy, Gary Hart withdrew from the primary. In December of 1987, Hart would attempt to launch a comeback, but it would fail to gain steam, in large part because, not long after the Miami Herald story broke, a photo of Hart appeared in tabloids across the country. In the photo, Hart was sitting on a yacht called Monkey Business with actress Donna Rice on his lap. This photo would prove to be too much for Hart to overcome. With their frontrunner Gary Hart out of the picture, Democrats saw what they believed to be a winnable presidential election slipping through their fingers. In what many called an act of desperation, the DNC reached out to several other potential candidates and asked them to join the race. Senator Ted Kennedy, who had famously decided not to run in the 1984 Democratic primary, made it clear he would not run in 1988. Party leaders even made a plea to the young governor of Arkansas, William Jefferson Clinton, but by July of 1987, Clinton announced he would not enter the primary either. As the reality of the situation set in, Democratic leadership knew they had to throw their support behind someone already in the race. Many turned their attention to Delaware Senator Joseph R. Biden Jr. to fill the void Hart left behind. Joe Biden had served in the Senate for 15 years. He had experience, but he was young. He was highly educated, but he came from a blue-collar background. Party members hoped these seeming contradictions would help Biden appeal to a wide coalition of voters like Hart had done in the 1984 Democratic primary. Most importantly, Biden didn't seem prone to the questions of character that had plagued Hart even before the Donna Rice story and photos emerged. However, just as some Democrats began to shift their support to Biden, scandal rocked the 1988 election again. Rumors that Joe Biden had plagiarized parts of several of his speeches began to surface. Quickly on the heels of the allegations, a videotape emerged showing Biden giving a stump speech that borrowed heavily from an earlier speech given by Neil Kinnock, the leader of Britain's Labour Party at the time. On the campaign trail, Biden had almost always credited Kinnock in his speeches, but he didn't in this particular video. Though Biden defended himself and suggested that he had made an honest mistake, the video proved a stain on his image. Things had gotten worse for Biden at a campaign event in New Hampshire in April 1987, when a man in the crowd asked Biden, "What law school did you attend and where did you place in that class?" Irritated by the question, Biden had replied, "I think I probably have a much higher IQ than you do, I suspect." Biden then claimed he graduated in the top half of his law school class, but it was a lie. And when the press cried foul, Biden was forced to issue a statement admitting he had embellished his academic record. Biden's gaffes dogged his campaign, and as the months rolled on, the hits kept coming. including a rumor that Biden plagiarized a paper during his time in law school. In September 1987, Biden called a press conference admitting, "I did something very stupid 23 years ago." As the Washington Post reported at the time, Biden noted that the faculty of the Syracuse University Law School had allowed him to repeat the course after initially flunking him for lifting without citation 5 pages from a published law review, and said that his dean later vouched for his high character. Biden said, "If anyone tells you Joe Biden isn't a straight arrow, I'd be very surprised." But the pressure to withdraw was immense, and later that same month, Biden made headlines again by making a stunning announcement.
There is one less candidate in the race for the presidency tonight. Delaware Senator Joseph Biden dropped out of the hunt today, saying the disclosures about his plagiarism in law school and his exaggerations about his academic record made it impossible for him to continue.
I do it with incredible reluctance, and it makes me angry. I'm angry with myself for having been put myself in the position of having to make this choice.
The Delaware Democrat is the second candidate to be forced from the race by questions of character and integrity. Gary Hart dropped out earlier this year.
In less than 5 months, the Democrats had lost their clear frontrunner and a well-liked, highly experienced senator with a strong campaign behind him. The question then became who could possibly rise to the top in a field of relative unknowns. Some argued that in Jesse Jackson, the party already had a candidate with wide name recognition and a history of strong campaigning behind him. Jackson had fared relatively well in the 1984 primary, staying in the race almost to the convention and picking up a number of delegates on the way. Despite that, Jackson remained a polarizing figure in the Democratic Party, and many believed his appeal was limited to the South. In the fall of 1987, one man began to separate himself from the pack, the little-known governor of Massachusetts, Michael Dukakis. In October, it came out that the video of the plagiarized Biden speech had been leaked to the media by members of Dukakis' campaign staff. The Biden video helped clear the way for Dukakis, and the Dukakis campaign capitalized on the opportunity. While one staff member stepped down for his role in leaking the video, Dukakis survived the ensuing backlash and quickly started to gain national exposure. As 1987 drew to a close, it was Dukakis who emerged as the party favorite. 1988 would mark Ronald Reagan's final year in the Oval Office. While Dukakis took his place as the Democratic Party's frontrunner, Reagan's Vice President George H.W. Bush set out to convince the country that a Bush presidency would continue and expand Reagan's legacy. But lacking the on-camera charm and easygoing presence Reagan demonstrated throughout his career, Bush would quickly find himself struggling to connect with the national media and the American public. With Michael Dukakis' popularity on the rise and Kansas Senator Bob Dole mounting a Republican primary challenge, George H.W. Bush would soon discover that unlike Ronald Reagan, he wasn't made of Teflon, and he wasn't immune to the fallout from Iran-Contra.
Entrando em contato com atendimento ao cliente... Para muitas pessoas é um jeito fácil de arruinar um bom dia. Mas na Zendesk, nós deixamos a experiência do cliente melhor. Melhor para sua avó, melhor para seu vendedor preferido de flores, melhor para o cara do apartamento 3A, melhor para você, melhor para todos. Porque enquanto alguns dizem que o cliente sempre tem razão, nós dizemos que o cliente é sempre humano. E como seres humanos, queremos fazer algo melhor para todos nós. Zendesk, experiência do cliente com IA desenvolvida para humanos.
Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also ad-free, like Her Half of History. Because even though Hillary Clinton may not have made history when she ran for president in 2016, there have always been women who seized power, spied for their country, created artistic masterpieces, even escaped slavery. Her Half of History is perfect for all those who sat in history class and wondered, what were the women doing all this time? Because the answer is a lot. Get Her Half of History, Wicked Game, and many others ad-free at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. It's Monday, January 25th, 1988, 13 days before the Iowa caucuses, the first vote of the primary season. Vice President George H.W. Bush sits behind the desk in his office, preparing to do a live interview with Dan Rather for CBS Evening News. Bush knows there are serious questions about his ability to hold on to the White House for the Republican Party, but he hopes the interview with Rather will give him a chance to show the American people why he's the clear choice to be president. Bush watches the monitor on his desk, which allows him to see the segment leading into his interview. It's a taped report by Rather, and it has nothing to do with George Bush's proposed policies. Its sole focus is Iran-Contra.
Yet questions remain about Vice President Bush's role in the Iran arms sale. He insists he was out of the loop, uninformed about the events and the risks of the Iran initiative. But the record shows Mr. Bush attended more than 15 meetings in the Oval Office at which the arms sales were discussed.
The pre-taped segment shifts from Vice President Bush's potential knowledge of the arms for hostages deal in Iran to his possible involvement with supporting the Contras in Nicaragua. Rather highlights testimony from CIA operative Felix Rodriguez, who claims Vice President Bush's advisor Donald Gregg was a major part of the illegal operation, and that Vice President Bush knew exactly what was happening in Central America. For his part, Bush maintained Donald Gregg had never informed him of his role in Iran-Contra. As the tape segment ends and the live interview begins, Bush steels himself for a fight.
Mr. Vice President, thank you for being with us tonight.
Rather wastes no time. He launches directly into a series of questions regarding the vice president's knowledge of the Iran-Contra affair and his actions following it.
Donald Gregg still serves as your trusted advisor. He was deeply involved in running arms for the Contras, and he didn't inform you. Now, when President Reagan's trusted advisor, Admiral Poindexter, failed to inform him, the president fired him. Why is Mr. Gregg still inside the White House and still a trusted advisor?
Bush quickly volleys the attack. He makes it clear he has no interest in discussing matters that have already played out over hours and hours of the televised Iran-Contra hearings, and he reiterates that Gregg did not pass information along to him.
Because I have confidence in him, and because this matter, Dan, as you well know, and your editors know, has been looked at by the $10 million study by the Senate and the House. It's been looked at by the Tower Commission. The Rodriguez testimony that you put on here, I just think it's outrageous because he was totally vindicated, swore under oath that he never talked to me about the Contras.
So instead of staying on the defense, Bush goes on the attack, arguing that Dan Rather's network, CBS, brought him on the air under false pretenses.
And yet this report you're making, which you told me, or your people did, you have a Mr. Cohen that works for you, was going to be a political profile. Now, if this is a political profile for an election, I have a very different opinion as to what one should be.
The tension quickly escalates, and at several points throughout the interview, the two men speak over each other.
You know what I'm hiding? What I told the president. That's the only thing. And I've answered every question put before me. Now, if you have a question, what is it?
I do have one.
Please.
I have one.
Please fire
You have
away.
said that if you had known, this was an arms for hostages
Yes.
swap, that you would have opposed it. You also said
Exactly.
that you did not know that
May I answer that?
That wasn't a question, it was a
yes,
statement.
It was a statement, and
Let
I'll
me ask the
answer it.
question
The
if I may
president
first.
Bush grows angrier and angrier throughout, and eventually drops all pretense. He calls out Rather directly and takes a personal shot at the TV host regarding an embarrassing moment in his career.
I don't want to be argumentative, Mr. Vice
You
President.
do, Dan.
No,
This is not a
no,
great
sir, I don't.
night because I want to talk about why I want to be president, why those 41% of the people are supporting me.
And, Mr.
I
Vice
don't
President,
think it's
these
fair
questions
to
are
judge a
designed-
whole career. It's not fair to judge my whole career by a rehash on Iran. How would you like it if I judged your career by those 7 minutes when you walked off the set in New York?
Well,
Now, would you like that?
Mr.
I have
Vice
respect
President,
for you, but I don't have respect for what you're doing here tonight.
After 9 tense minutes, Rather thanked George Bush, and the live interview came to an abrupt end. But Bush wasn't finished. He barked at the CBS staff, "Tell your goddamn network that if they want to talk to me, to raise their hands at a press conference. No more Mr. Inside stuff." After the interview, the response from journalists and viewers was immediate. Local CBS outlets were flooded with calls, many from people who believed Rather was rude and treated the vice president unfairly. David Hoffman of the Washington Post referred to the interview as an emotional shouting match, and media anchors across the country started recapping the clash or brawl that took place on CBS Evening News. But for all the protestations, the question as to whether or not the vice president came into the interview unaware that the sole focus would be Iran-Contra remained a topic of debate for years. Rather, and his CBS colleagues claim Bush and his people knew exactly what they were signing on for, and that Bush's anger had simply been an act. Act or not, the interview quickly became the biggest moment of George H.W. Bush's candidacy up to that point. But with the Iowa caucus less than 2 weeks away, It remained to be seen if the interview helped or hurt the vice president's prospects. While many felt the interview showed Bush's strength, many others felt rather had delivered Bush a nearly mortal blow. Throughout his career as a World War II fighter pilot, an ambassador, the head of the CIA, and as a politician, George H.W. Bush had earned a reputation for being calm and measured. Over his years in the public eye, Bush's reserved nature led some to claim he was weak, uninterested, or even a wimp. In the Dan Rather interview, many journalists felt like they saw a side of the vice president they hadn't seen before. The New York Times' William Safire went so far as to write, "If George is a wimp or a lapdog, beware of wily wimps and ferocious lapdogs. Tip your hand that you intend to rub them the wrong way, and they'll be ready to go for your throat." While many supporters claimed the interview made Bush look strong, many others saw a defensive man who was more interested in evading questions than speaking the truth. But heading into Iowa, Iran-Contra wasn't Bush's only concern. There was also Senator Bob Dole. Dole had announced his candidacy on November 9, 1987, in his hometown of Russell, Kansas. Dole was no stranger to the campaign trail. He had run unsuccessfully as Gerald Ford's vice presidential candidate in 1976 and had competed in the 1980 GOP primary. Dole was an experienced politician and a war hero, and his campaign professed experience, strength, common sense, uncommon sensitivity, and uncompromising moral values. As scandal plagued both parties in the 1988 primaries, Dole's personal life remained above reproach, and he had started to gain ground on Vice President Bush. On February 8, 1988, Iowans headed to caucuses across the state to cast the first votes of the primary season. Bush believed a strong showing would allow him to put Bob Dole in the rearview mirror and demonstrate he was the clear frontrunner. Bush knew all too well the importance of the Iowa caucus. Because 8 years earlier, in the 1980 Republican primary, Iowa had put George Bush on the map. In the months leading up to the 1980 Iowa caucus, Bush was barely registering in the polls. But thanks to an aggressive ground game, Bush ended up beating Ronald Reagan in one of the most stunning upsets in Iowa caucus history. While Reagan would eventually win the nomination, Iowa had made Bush a clear contender and set him on the path that would lead to the vice presidency. But in 1988, Iowa proved disastrous for the Bush camp. With questions about Iran-Contra still hanging over his head, Bush won only 19% of the vote. Bob Dole's campaign and his message of uncompromising moral values had connected with Iowans. He won the state with 37% of the vote and proved to be a real threat to Bush's chances at securing the GOP nomination. Losing to Dole alone would have been bad enough for the Bush campaign. But with 25% of the vote, televangelist Pat Robertson also beat the vice president in Iowa. Democratic hopeful Michael Dukakis didn't fare much better in Iowa either. With 22% of the vote, he finished in third place behind a U.S. representative from Missouri, Dick Gephardt, and Illinois Senator Paul Simon. With the New Hampshire primary set for the following week, both Bush and Dukakis had to quickly put Iowa behind them and refocus. As governor of Massachusetts, Dukakis felt confident his fellow New Englanders would give him a decisive victory in New Hampshire, and he was right. He would go on to beat his closest competitors by 16 points. The Bush camp, however, had a much bigger battle on their hands. As the February 13th New Hampshire primary approached, tracking polls conducted by the Washington Post and ABC News showed Bob Dole moving past the vice president. Many in the media started to count Bush out of the race. In an attempt to turn things around, his team employed a new strategy in the final days of the New Hampshire campaign. This new approach would signal a change in the Bush campaign that would continue through the general election and cause a significant shift in how presidential campaigns would be conducted in the future. With the aid of political consultants, including Roger Ailes and Lee Atwater, the Bush campaign launched a negative ad against Bob Dole in New Hampshire. The ad called Dole's record into question and branded him Senator Straddle. It painted Dole as a man who couldn't make up his mind on major issues, often straddling the fence.
George Bush says he won't raise taxes, period. Bob Dole straddled, and he just won't promise not to raise taxes. And you know what that means.
The Bush campaign's new look and the anti-Dole ad paid off. At the New Hampshire primary on February 13, 1988, Bush bounced back. He won 38% of the vote, beating Bob Dole by almost 10 points. In his New Hampshire victory speech at a hotel in Manchester, Bush proclaimed, "Tonight I somehow feel I have a lot in common with Mark Twain. Reports of my death are greatly exaggerated." For Dole, the Senator Straddle ad was the beginning of the end. Dole fought back, accusing Bush of distorting the truth and lying about his record. but the damage was done. When Super Tuesday arrived on March 8th, Bush grabbed control of the primary, taking 500 delegates to Dole's 100. With Dole on the ropes, Bush's top advisors turned their attention to the now presumptive Democratic nominee, Michael Dukakis. In May of 1988, Bush trailed Dukakis by as many as 17 points in national polls. Then, on May 20th, Paul Kirk, the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, called George Bush out publicly, saying the vice president was a quintessential establishment elitist Republican, and that he had neither the toughness to govern nor the compassion to care. In response, the Bush camp would fight back. Even though the Republican convention was still months away and Bush's nomination was not yet officially won, many of Bush's closest advisors would start to lay the groundwork for a massive attack on Dukakis' image. Over Memorial Day weekend, while the vice president relaxed at the Bush compound in Kennebunkport, Maine, Republican consultants Lee Atwater and Roger Ailes would be hard at work. Hidden in a room behind a two-sided mirror, Atwater and Ailes would not only change the course of the 1988 election, they would change the art of presidential campaigning for decades to come. If you're a careful Wicked Game listener, you know in the credits I mentioned my friend Professor Greg Jackson and his podcast, History That Doesn't Suck. It's a great show. But one way it can doesn't suck even more is when you listen to it without ads. You can listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game, all episodes of History That Doesn't Suck, and all episodes of many more great history podcasts without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. History That Doesn't Suck is a deeply researched chronological survey of American history from a trained academic who also knows how to tell a story. Plus, in addition to ad-free listening to one of the best American history podcasts out there, you get scores of bonus episodes at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free, like Wild West Extravaganza, a journey back to the fascinating, tumultuous, and often violent world of the American Old West. From famous outlaws like Billy the Kid and Jesse James, to lawmen like Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok, to trailblazing pioneers and frontiersmen, Wild West Extravaganza tells the true stories of the real-life characters who shaped this iconic era. So saddle up and discover the true history of the American frontier, the good, the bad, and the ugly, ad-free at intohistory.com. It's May 30th, 1988, Memorial Day in Paramus, New Jersey. Political consultants Lee Atwater and Roger Ailes stand behind a two-way mirror that looks into a conference room in a sleek office building. Standing next to them are three men: Vice President Bush's chief of staff, a Bush pollster, and one of Bush's senior advisors. On the other side of the glass sits a group of people who've been paid $30 each to be part of a political focus group. Bush's chief of staff is skeptical about this. I thought you didn't trust focus groups, Roger. I don't, but this one might actually prove useful. Why? Who are they? Well, tell them, Lee. Everyone in that room voted for Reagan in 1984. Everyone in that room says they're voting for Dukakis in 88. They're low-end, white-collar, and high-end blue-collar voters. Stuart Spencer did some consulting for the party, and he said he saw a Mediterranean tilt with people like this who are changing their votes. Mediterranean tilt? What the hell is that? Italian, Catholic. We've got a good mix in there. And they're going to tell us why they're leaving the party. No, we're going to tell them why they have to come back. The men settle into their seats and listen as the moderator tells the focus group the story of a man named Willie Horton. Well, folks, thanks for joining us. I want to tell you a little story. In 1975, Willie Horton was found guilty of robbery and first-degree murder in the state of Massachusetts. Willie and two others robbed and brutally stabbed two innocent people. Willie Horton was put away for life without parole. However, Massachusetts has what is known as a prison furlough program, a program that allows prisoners like Willie Horton out on unsupervised 48-hour leave. The moderator doesn't mention the program was started by a Republican governor and that it's not the only one of its kind. He keeps the story focused solely on Willie Horton. On one of his many furloughs, while the program was being overseen by Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis, Willie Horton left Massachusetts and traveled to Maryland. There, he broke into the home of a couple that was engaged to be married. Over the course of several hours in the house, Willie Horton tortured and slashed the man with a knife and then raped the woman. After finishing the story, the moderator goes around the room for reaction. By the end of the meeting, every member of the focus group says they will now be voting for George H.W. Bush. Lee Atwater couldn't be happier. That was very good. That was very good. By the time we're finished, they're going to wonder whether Willie Horton is Dukakis' running mate. On June 22, 1988, less than a month after the focus group, George Bush gave a speech at the National Sheriff's Association. It was the first time he mentioned Willie Horton publicly, but that was only the beginning. As the primaries would come to an end and the general election would come into focus, the Republicans would put Michael Dukakis in their crosshairs, and as Atwater himself said, they would strip the bark off the little bastard. On July 21, 1988, Michael Dukakis made his acceptance speech at the Democratic National Convention and officially became the Democratic nominee for president. To offset the Republican-created image that he was an elite New England liberal who didn't understand Middle America, Dukakis chose Texas Senator Lloyd Benston as his running mate. Less than a month later, George H.W. Bush accepted the presidential nomination at the Republican convention in New Orleans. He selected a young conservative senator from Indiana, Dan Quayle, to be his vice presidential candidate. Coming out of the party conventions, Bush still trailed Dukakis in the polls by a significant margin. However, as the general election started in earnest, Dukakis' personality started to become an issue. He was seen by many Americans as cold and unlikable. Additionally, Republicans started to attack Dukakis, suggesting he would weaken America as a military power. Ads coming from the GOP implied Dukakis opposed all military-related spending. On one hand, George Bush was a decorated combat veteran who had stood alongside President Reagan as they challenged the Soviet Union. On the other side was Michael Dukakis, a liberal governor from New England who wouldn't provide the United States military with the resources it needed. That line of attack gained a foothold, and the Dukakis camp had to address it in some way. On September 13, 1988, hoping to demonstrate his support for the troops and the military might of America, Dukakis visited the General Dynamics facility in Sterling Heights, Michigan, to take a ride in a 68-ton M1A1 Abrams main battle tank. The photo op arguably proved to be the biggest misstep of Dukakis' campaign up to that point. Appearing small in an oversized helmet and wholly out of place, Dukakis and the tank picture became immediate fodder for late-night comedians and derision in the media. The polls had already been tightening, and the Bush camp knew the photo would only hurt Dukakis' numbers further. For Ailes and Atwater, it was time to make Willie Horton a household name. Behind the scenes, and supposedly without Bush's knowledge, multiple Willie Horton-themed ads were being developed. Ailes helped create a spot called Revolving Door that hammered Dukakis for the prison furlough program and insinuated that Dukakis was responsible for allowing murderers and rapists back into society. However, the ad that changed the 1988 election and would alter the shape of political ads for decades to come was known as Weekend Passes. With simple pictures of Bush, Dukakis, and Horton serving as the only visuals, the power of the ad was in the audio.
Bush and Dukakis on crime. Bush supports the death penalty for first-degree murderers. Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery, stabbing him 19 times. Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
The ad immediately came under fire from the Dukakis camp, members of the media, and activist groups across the country. They argued that by presenting the story of a black man who attacked a white couple, its only purpose was to stoke racial fears. Others pointed out that the weekend passes and revolving door ads were misleading when it came to the furlough program and the Horton case. But the ads were released by different groups with no direct connection to Vice President Bush, and he maintained he did not know the ads were coming out. Regardless of what connection existed between these ads and Bush, the connection between Willie Horton and Michael Dukakis was firm. The Massachusetts governor continued to dip in the polls, and the belief that he was dangerously weak on crime dogged his campaign. Willie Horton became such a part of the election that CNN news anchor and debate moderator Bernard Shaw opened the October 13, 1988 presidential debate with what would be considered one of the most shocking questions a presidential nominee had ever been asked.
Governor, if Kitty Dukakis were raped and murdered, Would you favor an irrevocable death penalty for the killer?
Without introduction or context, Shaw created a horrific scenario involving Michael Dukakis' wife. Dukakis responded.
No, I don't, Bernard, and I think you know that I've opposed the death penalty during all of my life. I don't see any evidence that it's a deterrent, and I think there are better and more effective ways to deal with violent crime. We've done so.
Like the Willie Horton ad, Bernard Shaw's question was derided by members of the media. However, the response from many viewers at home was that Dukakis had not shown enough emotion in his answer. It was perhaps the nail in the coffin. With less than a month before the debate, Dukakis wouldn't recover. On Tuesday, November 8, 1988, George H.W. Bush won 426 electoral votes to Dukakis' 111, making Bush the 41st president of the United States. After Bush won, many argued that the Willie Horton story was only one small part of the 1988 election and by no means the only reason Bush beat Dukakis. They pointed out that Dukakis' numbers had been trending the wrong way even before the Horton ad aired. However, almost everyone agreed that the Willie Horton ad had been effective. Even many who despised its content saw that ads like the Willie Horton spot had the power to change how presidential campaigns were run. 20 years after the ad aired, journalist Rachel Withers would write, George H.W. Bush's infamous Willie Horton ad was not the first racist political tactic, but it defined his presidential campaign. More importantly, it was the nexus for a particular type of attack that we still see today, a political strategy focused on demonizing black and brown people, stoking white fear and rage, and promoting ineffective, biased, expensive, and dangerous criminal justice policies. Republican strategist Lee Atwater recognized the significance of the Willie Horton ad, too. He also recognized the efficacy of dog whistling or the use of coded or suggestive language in political messaging without provoking opposition. Atwater summed up his views on the subject in a 1981 interview.
You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts your backfire. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now. You're talking about cutting taxes and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. And subconsciously, maybe that is part of it. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that if it is getting that abstract and that coded, that we're doing away with the racial problem one way or the other. You follow me? Because obviously sitting around saying we want to cut taxes, we want to cut this, and we want is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than nigger, you know.
Atwater would die at the age of 39, not even 4 years after helping George Bush win the White House. Suffering from an inoperable brain tumor, Atwater would write a final piece for Life magazine in 1991. In it, he would say, in 1988, fighting Dukakis, I said that I would strip the bark off the little bastard, make Willie Horton his running mate. I am sorry for both statements, the first for its naked cruelty, the second because it makes me sound racist, which I am not. Despite Atwater's apology, he helped usher in a major shift in campaign tactics. Following the 1988 election, both parties began to rely more heavily on political consultants to help craft an image for their candidates and their opponents. Atwater, Ailes, and others had helped George Bush make the 1988 election about the shortcomings and character flaws of Michael Dukakis. The benefit was that Bush won the election easily. The downside was that many believed Bush hadn't won because of his policies or his personality. With the economy faltering and Reagan's shadow looming over him, Bush's first term in the White House would get off to a rocky start. By the second year of Bush's presidency, campaign promises would fall by the wayside, and his catchphrases like a kinder, gentler America and not gonna do it would play better on Saturday Night Live than they would in practice. With Reagan gone and Bush struggling, the Democrats would finally see a way back into the White House after 12 long years on the outside. This is episode 51 of American Elections Wicked Game, 1988, Character Assassinations. On the next episode, the election of 1992, President George H.W. Bush tries to shore up his Republican coalition and offer the American people a clear picture of what a second Bush term would look like. Meanwhile, a young saxophone-playing Democratic governor from Arkansas and an independent Texas businessman will make a Bush second term seem almost impossible to achieve. Tired of ads and promos like these? Want to skip ahead to newer elections? You can listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. But not only that, you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free. That includes the American Revolution podcast, a deep and thorough investigation of the times, people, and politics behind America's fight for independence. Also, the battles, because we can't start a new American nation without guns. And the American Revolution podcast tells the story of the Revolution from beginning to end, from its origins in the French and Indian War, through the war itself, and on to the founding of the United States. Get American Elections Wicked Game, the American Revolutions podcast, and many others ad-free with bonus content at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. This episode contains reenactments and dramatized details, and while in most cases we can't know exactly what was said, all our dramatizations are based on historical research. American Elections Wicked Game is an Airship production, hosted, edited, and executive produced by me, Lindsey Graham. Audio editing by Molly Bach. Sound design by Derek Behrens. Music by Lindsey Graham. Co-executive produced by Stephen Walters in association with Ritual Productions. Written and researched by Michael Federico. Fact-checking by Greg Jackson and C.L. Salazar from the podcast History That Doesn't Suck.
According to some, Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole were two of the most prolific serial killers America's ever seen. But not everyone agrees with that assessment, and for good reason. Because although Lucas and Toole were killers, they were also men who'd happily lie to get what they want. And in the 1980s, they lied to a lot of people. Hi, I'm Jeremy Schwartz, host of the new true crime history podcast, American Criminal. We take you inside the minds of some of our most notorious felons and outlaws, exploring the dark side to the American dream. In our latest season, how two men conned an entire country and their role in the horrific crime that changed America forever. Listen to American Criminal, Serial Killers, Serial Liars, wherever you get your podcasts. Or to get early ad-free access to the entire season first, plus hundreds of other ad-free history podcast episodes, subscribe at intohistory.com.